Welcome everybody. My name is Julia Mortimer and I'm the Journals Director at Bristol University Press. Thank you so much for joining this webinar to celebrate the launch of the new journal, Work in the Global Economy. Just to let you know, we're recording it and we'll make it available on our website in due course. When we first started planning the journal, we never would have thought that work and labour issues would take front and centre stage quite as much as they have. As a result of so much change during the pandemic, it has become timelier than ever and fills a real gap in publication outlets for work and labour market research. The journal really lives up to its name in terms of the global, as you will see from the brilliant launch double issue, which includes authors from across the world. And we're really lucky to have Bridget, Martin, Ellen, Jake and Devi here today to talk about their articles, alongside Kirsty and Sian talking about the journal. I'm extremely proud and grateful that the fantastic editorial team behind the journal chose to publish it with Bristol University Press. I'd like to say huge thanks to Kirsty, Sian, Abigail, Paul and Safak for everything they've done in difficult circumstances to get it off the ground and with such a wonderful showcase of content. We're also delighted to be working in partnership with the International Labour Process Conference, which is celebrating its 40th anniversary next year and where the journal has its roots. Work in the Global Economy has had a fantastic reception so far, including on Twitter, where the account has over 800 followers already, and people have really been talking about the first issue and how much they're enjoying it. Do follow if you aren't already. Sign up to get the journal newsletter on the Bristol University Press website and help us spread the word. So please put your questions in the Q&A as we go along. We'll have time to answer them at the end. I'm going to hand over to Kirsty now to tell you more about the journal.
Thank you very much, Julia. Just while Sian gets the slides in place. First of all, I hope that everybody has had opportunity to have a look at the journal and to see how vibrant the first issue is. And obviously we want to thank all of our authors for incredible tight timelines for producing the papers. But what I want to do is just to highlight some of the aims of the journal, and then I'm going to hand over to Sian, and she's going to highlight some of the main themes that we're exploring in this first launch issue, but we will also hopefully explore as the journal progresses. I think the first thing to say is that what we're trying to do with the journal is to open up a new space to start to analyse and debate the changing conditions of work and of labour in an area of globalised and unleashed capitalism. What we're wanting to do is to therefore interrogate both theoretically and empirically the labour process as a distinct moment in the circuits of capital. Having said that, clearly this is a complex task, and one of the key issues that has been in the domain of labour process and for work and employment writers more generally and researchers is how do we connect the politics of production with the wider contradictory processes of capital accumulation, and how do we attempt to theorise and explore these issues in empirical projects when these connections and articulations are so complex and immense. We're hoping that the journal becomes a space. I think we've got something sharing the presenter view going on as well with this, but we'll keep going. So what we want to do is to try and be an arena where we're able to connect the politics of production with the wider dynamics of the of political economy, and become an intellectual space where people are able to do that and explore some ideas. So Sian, if you could just move us on, that'd be great. Of course, keep going, that's it, brilliant. Of course, we are extremely proud and recognise that we are drawing on traditions of labour process, of labour process theory, and of course the Labour Process Conference. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Labour Process Conference, which grows in its vibrancy, and of course we're all hopefully going to turn up in Italy at some point next year, fingers crossed. What we want to do is draw on the close synergies and connections and the intellectual and theoretical traditions of the Labour Process Conference, which clearly has the shared vision of scholarship around empirical rigour, commitment to theory building, and a pioneering research agenda that goes back over many decades. And obviously the labour process tradition has drawn on that interplay between the labour process, the wage labour market, state regulation and the disciplinary powers of the state, as well as looking at how labour is organising and the wider arena within which this takes up this economy. So we very, very much want to draw and celebrate those traditions. But next slide, please, Sian. We also want to enable the journal to be something that thrives to sustain the labour process traditions, but we also want to deepen and extend this tradition further. And one of the key domains that we want to do this in is to try and build more on the international agenda of understanding work patterns and different organisation and different forms of organisation across different regions, across different nation states, and opportunities to explore how we can link international change of production, distribution and exchange. And we particularly welcome scholars from the Global South, and we would hope to be a voice, a mechanism that all different types of debates can get a space. So in doing that, we also want to look and reveal the ways in which social relations at work are also framed by wider class relations, and that these are also conditioned by crisis tendencies, regional inequalities, and uneven development. Necessarily, that means that we have to start unpacking the heterogeneous position of labour, moving labour process on slightly to start looking at different forms of exploitation, recognising that they're diverse and overlapping. And I would say the journal enables us to answer the compelling case that there is now to explore the nexus of connections between forced, informal, formal and regular forms of exploitation, how they interact with reproduction and social reproduction, and to move the sphere of understanding some of this. We also then necessarily have to say, well, okay, we need to intersect with wider disciplinary bases. So we would celebrate and welcome papers that engage with labour geography, with development studies, with wider political economy. So to outline some of the themes, I'm going to pass over to Sian.
Okay, so I think our double launch issue reflects some of these pressing theoretical and empirical questions. And I think first amongst these points of intersection is the dynamic relationship between productive and reproductive spheres, and between domestic and wage labour, obviously rooted in the gender division of labour. So historically, labour process theory has underplayed the importance of social reproduction, but more recently there's been a focus on reproductive labour undertaken by paid workers inside and outside the household, and the transformation of reproductive work into the productive work in the market. And I think that's an area we want to develop in the journal. Similarly, the conceptualisation of race and ethnicity and the labour process has been a neglected area, particularly in the global north. So in the light of the Black Lives Matter movement, we're very pleased in our launch issue to be able to publish 3 articles which explore the dynamics of racialised capitalism, and the authors of these are going to introduce those in a minute. Also deserving of attention is the concept of labour regimes, deployed in studies to articulate relations between different forms of labour across spatially distinct production sites within integrated supply chains. And we want to broaden the debate and deepen the understanding of these diverse patterns of spatially differentiated formal and informal labour practices. So in this issue, Alex Wood explores the potential power of workplace regime with reference to research in retail sectors in the UK and US. So explaining patterns of control and the dynamics of workplace politics through an engagement with science and technology studies and economic sociology. And Alex argues that his framework can explain commonalities and regularities across seemingly divergent contexts, as well as variation within regimes. Obviously, we want to link labour process to the labour movement. And we've got a couple of articles that do just that. So Shafak Tartamoglu-Bennett, Nick Hammer and Jean Jenkins explore the opportunity for worker organising and worker agency within the global apparel supply chain. And their study is a longitudinal case study of Turkish garment workers who were seeking remedy for lost earnings and severance pay following factory closure. So they look at the emergence of a global governance gap after the brands, the state and employers all reneged on promises to safeguard labour rights. And they develop a political economy perspective focusing on the intersecting and competing roles of different forms of capital and the state in curtailing workers' paths to remedy in the global apparel value chain. Similarly, the efficacy of worker organising is explored by Barbara Samalak and Ian Greer, looking at young workers' transitions from education to work in neo-corporatist Slovenia. So they invoke institutional forces that, since some austerity measures removed government-funded internships and reduced entry-level jobs, leading to precarity for the next generation professionals excluded from the labour market. And their study illuminates the importance of education to work transitions and the key role of self-organised communities or quasi-independent trade unions in the creation of a collective sense of injustice. And they suggest the need for unions to become more present within transitional spaces that are shaped by state policies. We're familiar with projections of widespread automation, robotisation, supplication of labour by artificial intelligence, exemplified by the digital economy. And we know this is going to continue to drive analysis and debates on work transformation in the global north and the global south. So we're very pleased to present articles that initiate this debate. So Paul Thompson and Knut Lazar have argued that the technological determinism that is a common feature of these debates on the future of work, and has resurfaced in the discourse around the fourth industrial revolution, can be checked by a revitalised foundational labour process analysis. So they combine first and second wave labour process theory to retain a focus on agency, but also to address the workplace centricity characteristic of the second wave, to reassert the wider structural context, embedding the materiality of technology in specific business models and control regimes. So they give greater weight to sources of contestation and the levels of strategic choices. And their work is based on case studies of call centres and digital labour practices, platforms. And similarly, Martin Krzywdzinski and Christine Gerber have put forward a typology of labour control in online crowdwork platforms, but Martin is going to talk about that as well in a minute, so I shall leave that to him. Disruptions and subsequent renegotiations of the social order are going to be integral to the work in the global economy territory, particularly the state of the labour process and work in climate emergency, but also in the global health crisis engendered by COVID, which has led to a reassertion of the relationship between the labour process and worker health and safety. So in this issue, Phil Taylor looks at the interaction of COVID with the contact centre labour process. So he integrates the socially constructed built environment with a social organisation of work and provides a synthesis of epidemiological science with labour process theory to analyse the risk of infection in concrete work settings, where intimate knowledge of the organisation of work by workers was ignored. So Phil proposes a wide-angle lens capturing the external economic drivers that underlie the labour process, in this case, the value-generating activities of contact centres, and he sees that the potential to disrupt the labour process prompted default to actually an insistence on business as usual. Finally, we're really pleased to introduce our special feature, our new feature, Theory into Practice. And Theory into Practice tries to encourage academics and practitioners to reflect on the issues that emerge when translating conceptual or theoretical ideas into outcomes beyond the academy. So in the first one, Dave Smith discusses mobilisation theory, and he does so from the perspective, firstly, of a trade union activist who played a leading role in exposing the role of the large contractors in blacklisting construction workers, and secondly, as a trade union tutor. So Dave highlights the role of employer counter-mobilisation in preempting union organisation, and in so doing challenges any notion of mobilisation theory as a sequential process. And he also emphasises the role of rank and file leaders in leading sporadic, unofficial industrial action in the construction sector, which is characterised by self-employment and transitory working relationships. So we hope that this feature will evolve and incorporate a range of global contexts in the future. Finally, just to reiterate what Kirsty says, we're very grateful to all the contributors, to everybody who's reviewed very, very speedily for this issue, to the production team and to the editorial board and the associated editors. And we really, really urge you to submit to the journal, encourage your colleagues to submit to the journal, and the details are there. So I'm going to hand back to Julia to hear a little bit more about some of our articles.
Thanks so much, Sian and Kirsty. That was really helpful, and a great overview of the first issue. I'm going to use my crib sheet now that everybody managed to get a preview of earlier on. I'm very sorry that got shared over the slide, but just to let you know that we're going to hear from some of the article authors in the first issue, which is fantastic. They're joining us from all corners of the globe at different times, which is we appreciate even more. So first off, we have Devi Sacchetto, who is Associate Professor of Sociology and of Economic and Labour Processes at the University of Padua. Thank you, Devi.
Thank you, Julia. It's a pleasure to be here, to have published a paper on the first issue in a journal like Work in the Global Economy. First of all, the paper we published with Valeria Piro tried to highlight the role of race and racialization processes as pivotal in facilitating subcontracting. Our article is based on a research we did in the last 2 years concerning the meat industry in Italy, in particular in the north of Italy, and aims at highlighting how outsourcing and racialization actually overlap and reinforce each other in the everyday practice of work. Through the paper, we tried to explain how this process, outsourcing and racialization, have developed through time, because in Italy, we started in the 80s when South Italian migrants who were racialized and employed in meat processing industry and stigmatized as terroni, that is a word in Italy that it means rural people with poor educational background. And accordingly, they were considered as the most appropriate workforce for dirty jobs and degrading tasks. In the 90s, plants, the meat industry started to recruit mainly international migrants with different background from Asia, from Africa, and also from Latin America. And at the same time, also outsource labor, in particular through cooperative or convenience, we call not forced cooperative, but cooperative convenience that are created only to outsource part of the job. And consequently, South Italian workers were deracialized and improved their position with the internal workplace hierarchy. International subcontracted migrants have started to occupy the worst internal position, as they were now considered the more appropriate for dirty work. And in so doing, South Italian internal migrants have progressively become white, while at the same time, the international migrants began to take their place as the racialized others. In this regard, we have to stress that international migration towards Italy constitute the basis for the reactualization of a racialization process that have been present in the society for a long time, I think from colonial time in Italy at the end of 90s and the first of 20th century. This process of racialization and stigmatization carried out by both management and by local laborers led to the production of an internal workplace hierarchy based both on workers' contractual and social position, because local workers usually employed directly by the main company occupy the higher position, while Southern Italian workers are located in a better position compared to subcontracted international migrant workers. The recruitment of foreign workers for hazardous tasks in workplace makes it possible to create forms of vertical mobility for a part of the Italian workers with significant spillovers in the preservation of the social order. I mean that this division of labor is largely accepted and naturalized since it reflects the social order existing outside the shop floor, while at the same time it is internally functional to legitimize a higher level of control over the entire workforce. Moreover, in the North Italian context, traditional unions initially defended the core workers to preserve their working condition, while showed limited interest towards protecting subcontractor migrant workers' interests. This implied that solidarity ties between direct and subcontractor workers are often weak, while unions differentiate practice, reinforcing Italian migrants' opposition. The process of racialization, in any case, is sometimes re-signified by migrants themselves that organize in autonomous way, assuming a conflictual attitude both towards the meat processing companies and towards traditional unions. I mean that the migrant workers produce a collective space of discussion where race, skin color, migratory status are mobilized and used as a pretext to discuss about the common labor condition and take action. Our findings show that race can be a factor also of mobilization of subcontracting migrant labor through the production of pragmatic racial solidarities. These informal ties are a key component in the development of the everyday struggle and alliance that emerge within grassroots worker organizations, as well as beyond their boundaries through hybrid forms of collective organization. Our analysis aims also at shedding light on connection and intersection instead of distinction and separation between the inside and the outside of the workplace. This allows us to emphasize that the set of hierarchies, power relations, social categories existing outside of the workplace are mirrored inside firms. In other words, and I'm going to conclude, we show how the labor process is shaped around social division and broadly legitimized social categories widespread within the society at large. So I mean that the labor process and reproduction process are strictly linked, and the process of racialization and deracialization are working inside and outside. Thanks a lot.
Brilliant. Thank you, Debbie. I was just about to say, coming up to time. So now we're going to hand over to Ellen Reese, who is Professor of Sociology and Chair of Labour Studies at the University of California, and Jake Ali Mohammed Wilson, who's Professor of Sociology at California State University, to talk about their paper, which is about Amazon workers, as you can already see from the slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really excited to be here, honored to be included in this special double issue. On behalf of my colleague, Ellen Reese, one thing we wanted to mention, this is kind of a spin-off to a book project we published last year called The Cost of Free Shipping. And so last year, as we were promoting the book, we're studying the kind of wave of racial justice protests and how that impacted Amazon worker organizing. So this is the paper that we will talk about today. So one of the things that we start with our paper is we are really grounding the rise of Amazon in the global economy within Cedric Robinson's concept of racial capitalism, and really within kind of the neoliberal era. At Amazon, 71% of the top executives, the wealthiest in the organization, are white and mostly male. The direct contrast to the disproportionately white and male workforce in the executive class are over 2/3 of all workers in the blue collar portion of Amazon's workforce are Black and Latinx workers. So nearly 1 million US workers who are directly employed now, 68% are workers of color, about 33% of whom are Black, 22% are Latinx. So we argue that Amazon is a site to study contemporary racial capitalism within the neoliberal era. And so we're looking in this paper at how workers of color, although they're disproportionately impacted and exploited in the blue collar warehouse sector of Amazon's operations, they are leading the resistance and organizing in the United States. So here are some of our research questions. How do Black and Latinx workers disproportionately employed as blue collar warehouse workers in the US experience racial capitalism as it manifests in their oppressive working conditions within Amazon warehouses, including the mass surveillance of workers? We argue that the surveillance of workers is also a racialized form of worker control. How are Amazon warehouse workers resisting their oppressive conditions, and how are Black workers in particular helping to lead such efforts? Finally, what challenges does workplace surveillance create for organizing, and how has it facilitated retaliation against worker activists of color, including during the pandemic? So our data draws on a few different sources, 35 in-depth interviews with current and former Amazon warehouse workers employed during the pandemic in inland Southern California. Dr. Reese and a team of students interviewed workers in Riverside and San Bernardino counties through personal networks. Over 70% of these workers interviewed are Latinx. In addition, we profiled 3 key leading Black Amazon warehouse worker activists around the United States, West Coast, East Coast, and the central part of the United States. We also did a group interview with Amazonians United Chicagoland. This interview was actually a featured chapter in our book, The Cost of Free Shipping. And so we went back and drew on some of that data. In addition, we did a content analysis of newspaper articles and other reports. So we found that workers experience a grueling pace of work, high injury and turnover rates, and 93% of the interviewees agreed that they experience pain and fatigue. And finally, as many of you have been following, there's a degradation of work. We argue that this is connected to the devaluation of labor for workers of color. I'm going to pass it on to Ellen.
Thank you. One of the major concerns among workers, both among the worker leaders and those interviewed, were obviously health and safety on the job during the pandemic. Hibak Mohammed voiced the concerns of many when she said, "We don't have enough cleaning equipment and time to sanitize and clean our stuff. We need Amazon to take responsibility for their workers in this pandemic. Sometimes they," meaning the supervisors, "come up to you and let you know how you're doing or if you've performed poorly, and sometimes they get within 6 feet." And this concern was not just among the worker leaders, but also the rank and file workers that we interviewed for this study. We also in this paper highlight the role of Black-led worker resistance, and we highlight 3 case studies of this, the first of which was Awood Center, which Hibak Mohammed is a leading member of, as well as the Congress of Essential Workers. So the Awood Center is a Black Somali immigrant worker center that's organized in the Minneapolis region in Minnesota, or Shakopee, Minnesota. And in 2019, they engaged in a work stoppage against a work speed up that involved 30 out of 60 stowers on a night shift. Chris Smalls, meanwhile, has been very active in the Congress of Essential Workers, and he was a fired worker, an Amazon warehouse worker who was fired for breaking quarantine rules while organizing around health and safety during the pandemic, but that didn't stop him. He went on to found the Congress of Essential Workers, which advocates for the working class, and has organized a series of protests and marches outside of Jeff Bezos' mansions across the US, and currently is still working to organize and try to unionize warehouse workers in Staten Island, New York. Next. So we also, the third case we look at is the case of Amazonians United, which has also been led by BIPOC workers, or Black, Indigenous, and people of color warehouse workers. This organization is a rank and file, grassroots led group with chapters across US cities. We especially highlight Amazon Chicagoland, which is in the Chicago region. Based on our group interview with members of that organization. They talk about how they engaged in various collective actions, including walkouts, when improved working conditions, including better access to clean drinking water, payments when workers had to leave shifts due to blackouts, extreme heat, or a lack of packages. They also won health and safety improvements, including paid time off for part-time workers diagnosed with COVID-19. And finally, this paper highlights the extent of surveillance and retaliation against Black worker activists. That surveillance of workers isn't just around trying to get them to work quickly, efficiently, with minimal errors, but also has been used against Black worker activists. Hibak Mohammed put it this way: they are using the camera to target organizers who speak up. They are watching you all the time, every second, every minute, especially the leaders who are organizing. Smalls recall was fired. Hopkins, who we highlight in this paper as well, was suspended for 2 months, purportedly for breaking COVID-19 safety rules, while Mohammed faced write-ups for too much time off tasks, right? So these were examples of this retaliation against Black worker activists. But nevertheless, workers are organizing and seeking to unionize in the very labor hostile nation of the U.S. and including in the South in Bessemer, Alabama. Maybe many of you have heard about that campaign where Amazon barraged organizing workers with anti-union messages and even threatened to close the facility and lay off workers if the unionization campaign succeeded. In response to the union's objections, the National Labor Rights Board in the US found Amazon did indeed violate labor laws and a new election must be held. So this is an ongoing struggle. Next. Finally, I'll just conclude with these ideas that Black workers are disproportionately employed as Amazon warehouse workers in the United States. They've also been on the forefront of resisting Amazon and have linked their demands for economic and racial justice. And although mass surveillance of workers has facilitated retaliation against Amazon worker activists, more organizing among Amazon warehouse workers is likely to continue to grow, especially as Amazon is continuing to grow as well. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ellen and Jake. That's fascinating and important research to hear about. So next we're going to hear from Bridget Kenny, who's in South Africa, Professor of Sociology at the University of Witwatersrand, which I've probably pronounced wrong. So over to you, Bridget, to talk about your paper.
Great. Thanks very much. And I'm delighted to be here and to celebrate the launch of the double issue. I'm speaking to the contribution from myself and Eddie Webster, and I do believe he's actually in the audience after a long day of teaching trade unionists on the Global Labor University, True to Form. In this piece that we contributed called The Return of the Labor Process, Race, Skill, and Technology in South African Labor Studies, we outline a trajectory of labor studies in South Africa from the 1970s, when labor process theory reinvigorated what was then called industrial sociology. We trace 3 critical moments to argue, somewhat by provocation, that there is a return to labor studies in our current conjuncture in South Africa, which roots research in a broad understanding of the working class, linking multiple forms of work and labor, helping to explain movements, and directed by understandings of the reproduction of capitalist relations and its enduring racialization. These are important insights for a global scholarship, we think. I briefly outline this rich history. In the 1970s and 1980s, labor process studies entered sociology departments in South African universities through the work of Braverman, as it did elsewhere. But Braverman's work entered a very different context here. Key themes of study were around the racial division of labor, the racial composition of the working class related to work organization, new mechanization occurring which linked to changing skill composition as Black workers entered semi-skilled manufacturing jobs, and forms of racialized labor control, which critically included the apartheid state. A range of studies engaged wider debates then around racial capitalism as defined in quite heady debate, in fact, abstract heady debate coming out of South Africa, but from concrete spaces of the workplace. These questions responded to the emergence of the independent Black trade union movement in 1973. Thus, contributions directly linked transformations in work to changing labor organization. And this, we argue, is an enduring concern of South African labor studies into the present. The second moment is marked by the democratic transition in South Africa, with its first democratic elections in 1994. Here, work expanded to consider the changing labor regime as new labor and citizenship rights redefined workers' conditions, where the majority of workers, which were Black workers, now were enfranchised, and the industrial relations system expanded to a broader understanding of employee, and also to incorporate many more workers. This occurred in the context, though, of the opening of the economy in a flurry of capital restructuring. Labor sociologists engaged firm restructuring through questions of democratization then. We produced studies of the ways in which restructuring altered labor processes and labor markets with casualization, externalization, and informalization of employment. Scholars focused on difficulties posed for trade unions and on declining conditions of work, as well as how these shifts revealed changes to race-class relations on new political terrain. There was, we suggest, in the process, a shift from a more narrow studies of the labor process to broader concerns around class recomposition and the labor market. At the same time, new social movements forming to contest commodification of social services and of electricity and water, housing, land redistribution, and healthcare actively altered the landscape. These movements pushed against the commodification of public goods as the state consolidated forms of neoliberal policy and shifted debate to concerns extending beyond the workplace. They marked broader political debate emerging in post-apartheid South Africa that in fact challenged traditional trade union politics. Dynamics within COSATU, the major federation, and between the federation and its alliance partner, the ruling African National Congress, also conditioned this period. Those studying labor increasingly focused on precarious work, wagelessness, and informal work linked to questions of new forms of mobilization and organizing, as well as questions around household survival and increasing unemployment and inequality. The third moment we periodized from about 2012 with what's called the Marikana Massacre, in which 34 striking platinum mine workers were killed by police. This event affected COSATU, leading to a quite dramatic reorganization of the labor movement, inspired more strikes, and revealed starkly how the labor relation endured as a site of the extraction of value and contestation around it. We identify a recentering of studies on the world of work in the present period, which of course I think as we heard at the beginning, have only been exacerbated more through the COVID period. They include ongoing studies on work reorganization in specific sectors like in mining, but we suggest there's a next generation of scholars clustered around 4 areas of new research, which continues key themes. First, there are those working on new technologies and skill reorganization, including new work on the gig economy and platform work, and new work as well on e-commerce. I should just mention. This work describes labor processes and how precarious workers are mobilizing in new ways. Second, continued work on precarious work considers new bargaining power by a now dominant workforce and how this has led to new demands and forms of organization. Third, other studies explore the reproduction and transformation of collective subjectivities defined in labor processes, but for wider political significance beyond the workplace, including around gender, race, and nationality. And fourth, we also find significant a new tentative labor history, asking questions around multiple forms of labor coercion, which track long trajectories of capitalist relations in Southern Africa. We argue that South African labor studies raise important questions to the global study of work, refusing an orientation to a factory-bound locus of the workplace, as well as an orientation of the labor process to firm dynamics alone. This suggests that the significance of studies of work rest in understanding the changes to capitalist political economies in which we are challenged to articulate complex sets of relations. In short, South African debates offer several key insights to scholars interested in the labor process and labor studies. First, that the stakes of studying work and labor extend to detailing changing forms of working class politics. Second, the changes to the organization of work must be understood as imbricating with the reproduction of labor, involving waged and unwaged forms of work, themselves related to forms of struggle. Third, that these processes remain an important site to explain changing forms of capital accumulation. And fourth, that this long history suggests how race continues to co-constitute the reproduction of capitalist relations. Thanks very much.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Bridget. And our last speaker today is Martin Krzywdzinski. I was trying to pronounce that properly. I'm sorry, Martin. And Martin is from WZB in Berlin and also Professor of International Labour Relations at the Helmut Schmidt University in Hamburg. Over to you, Martin.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm pleased to briefly introduce here the paper I developed together with my colleague Christine Gerber. The paper is about forms of labor control on crowdwork platforms. I think it ties in this way into a central theme that will be very important for the work in the Global Economy Journal, the relationship between technological and organizational change and its impact on work. In this context, platform work is an important field of research in which it is necessary both to revisit the traditional concepts of labor process theory and to develop new ones. Our paper connects to a lively discussion about algorithmic management on platforms. While this concept gives a fresh view on traditional questions regarding direct and indirect control in the labor process, we argue that it is used to describe very different labor control regimes, and for this reason, it's actually too broad. We argue that there is a need for a systematic discussion on the diversity and types of labor control in platform work. What we try to do is developing a typology of forms of labor control on crowdwork platforms, focusing on two factors. First, automated output control via technical platform infrastructure, and second, indirect control, indirect control based on ranking and reputation systems, which we call gamification. Our feeling is that most studies focusing on ride sharing and delivery platforms emphasize direct control. But in particular, in the realm of crowdwork jobs, however, forms of indirect gamification, seeking to win the workers' hearts and minds through feelings of fun, sometimes excitement, play an important role. Our paper relies on case studies of platforms in the survey of crowd workers conducted in the US and Germany. Maybe a few, very briefly, crowd work is a specific form of platform work. It is conducted online, which means that it's location independent. And for this reason, it differs in some respects from other forms of platform work, like for instance, Uber drivers, food delivery riders, which are also mentioned by the other speakers. In the field of crowd work, the combination of automation and gamification creates four potential constellations of labor control. First, some tasks remain regulated by pure customer control and do not include neither automated nor direct control, neither automated direct control nor gamification. Second, we have what we call automated despotism, that is constellations that use automated task checks, which can be quite rigid. Third, we have pure gamification constellations, and fourth, finally, the combination of both, which we call gamified automation. And we argue that regarding work-related outcomes, this gamified automation stands out. It displays the strongest combination of control forms and generates, at least in our survey, the highest stress level among the survey participants. What is puzzling, however, is that at the same time, it also shows the highest work satisfaction levels. We attribute this to the positively perceived work content, salaries, and opportunities for advancement. And we describe gamified automation as a kind of golden cage. It is stressful, but this stress goes along with attractive tasks and working conditions. I think these findings suggest skepticism regarding simple control resistance theoretical models, which we still find sometimes in studies on platform work. And I think recently and prominently, this was formulated in a paper by Catherine Kellogg, Melissa Valentine, and Angel Christine in the Academy of Management Annals. Of course, forms of labor control in platform work do evoke resistance, in some areas as collective action, in others as individualized shirking strategies. We think, however, that a critical labor process perspective must also be able to deal with the fact that in relevant parts of the platform workforce, there is a positive perception of earning opportunities and work contents that leads to an acceptance of algorithmic forms of labor control, in particular in contexts characterized by gamification, as our paper shows. A further important argument of our paper is that we see a strong fragmentation of crowd workers. There are strong differences in the perceptions of this type of work and also the respective labor control forms between self-employed, fully dependent on platform work, and other crowd workers who are doing these jobs besides a part-time or full-time employment in a different sector. Self-employed describe platform work as particularly stressful, but also as a particular opportunity. Our results imply that working on the same platform does not necessarily lead to shared work experiences. In terms of organizing and collective action, one implication could be that rather than a universal approach, fragments of a platform workforce should be specifically addressed, for instance, precarious part-timers or professional freelancers. And to conclude, I think labor process theory has historically focused a lot on the political economy and workplace internal factors. But what we need to do in future more is to include labor market conditions in the explanation of work perceptions in a more systematic way. And I will conclude here. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody. And we've got some time now for questions, but first of all, I'd like to say that the really interesting, fascinating and important research that's going on. And, you know, it's fantastic to hear about it. And there are other articles to explore in the journal too, but to hear that from all of you in depth about those papers today has been brilliant. So we've got some questions that are coming in and a couple of ones on the chat. The first question that we had was for Jake and Ellen from Spencer Potica. I think, Jake, have you answered that one, or did you want to? Yeah, so
I can speak this. I'm sure Ellen can as well. This is a really great question. And I think that, you know, what we didn't cover in some of our presentation was a lot of the contradictions that in particular Black workers were expressing to us, that at the same time, so, you know, our interviews were going on during the pandemic as, you know, movements for racial justice and anti-white supremacist organizing was, you know, burgeoning in the US, right? That Amazon spent a lot of money hanging, you know, banners and slogans in warehouses like Black Lives Matter, while you know, Black workers in their own warehouses were being treated as disposable, right? And so a lot of the workers were talking about those contradictions and making the connections between the surveillance and technologies that are used to survey and suppress Black people in prisons, in the prison industrial complex, are very much reminiscent in kind of the labor process in Amazon's warehouses in the US. And finally, I think underscoring, you know, the connections with, you know, much of the movements were also calling out the contradictions of police associations. I won't use the term police unions because they're not workers, that police officers in the United States don't defend workers or working class people, they attack them. And so those connections were drawn out as well. I'll pass it to Ellen as well.
Well, I see there's a related question from Julia Mortimer. Is it okay if I address that one as well, around this similar themes? And she says,
sorry, Ellen, that was me. That was just me posting the question from Spencer in the chat because people said they couldn't see it.
No wonder it was so related. Yeah. All right. So, and I think for me, what comes to mind too is thinking about what do we mean by the labor movement, right? And sometimes there's very narrow definitions of sort of workers going on strike, right? And I think there's been pushback against narrowly defining that and bringing in instances of worker protests and walkouts, right, that are very much a part of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think, many of the worker leaders that were highlighted in our paper, are also part of that movement. So, I think it's arguing that, when we talk about worker strikes, it's not just simply, strikes that are organized by a formal union, right? But that other forms of worker organizing also lead to collective action by labor. And we saw that both, in the Black Lives Matter movement more broadly, as well as in the efforts to organize Amazon warehouse workers, many of whom are Black.
Thank you, Ellen. And Jake did actually, I'm sorry that you can't see the Q&A. I think that's because I'm asking the questions of the participants, but I'll post Jake's response, or perhaps Thea, you could do that into the chat as well. Thank you both for answering that question. So we did have a comment in the chat, which was about Martin's presentation, asking if you could elaborate on the last sentence of your argument, Martin.
Of course, thank you for this question. So actually, our argument starts with looking at these labor control regimes and confronting the fact that we have resistance, we have conflicts, but we observe this still strong acceptance of these working conditions, of this type of work on crowd work platforms. And partially we try to explain this with different forms of labor control, as I described with this gamification. But still, this doesn't explain everything. Despite these labor control regimes, we still observe quite a strong variety of perceptions of work, even within platforms. Partially, this within platform variety is higher than between platform variety, even though we have stronger differences between platforms. The question is how to explain this. A part of the explanation might be that actually platforms combine a variety of tasks. So this might be not the case with ride-sharing platforms, but in crowd work, you often have a bunch of more complex, more simpler tasks, etc., which are organized via the platform. So this might explain the variance. But I think, or what we argue is that the labor, let's say the question how long people want to stay, if it's a part-time job for them or full-time, if they need to cover to make all their earnings there or not, all these factors, if they have a family or not, which role this income plays, how they perceive that this frames a lot their perception of this work, that these factors, the position of people in the labor market, maybe also their family situation, this must be really taken into account to explain their perceptions of platform work and also their behavior in this context. And I think this linkage between workplace internal factors and the broader labor market, social demographic conditions is something to be taken more seriously in the future.
Thank you, Martin. We've had a question, a more general question about the journal. And it says, thank you all. Questions for any panelists who want to answer. Given that this is the launch of the journal on work in the global economy, in what areas do you think there is the most urgent need for new contributions to knowledge within what is a very broad field? who would like to take that one?
Want me to come in here?
Kirsty?
Thanks, Rachel, for the question. I mean, we've outlined in the introduction to this launch issue some of the areas that we see that would be important areas for further development. Obviously, the issue of the relationship between production and reproduction is something that I think we could explore further. And inevitably, the debates about technology and the changing nature of work and non-work and how we can articulate that is something that I think will continue to be an area of interest. And of course, very much in our heads at the moment is the relationship between paid work and the wider issues about the climate crisis and how that will change our conceptions and understandings of work. I think anything in the, and of course the impact of COVID will continue to be contemporary for some time. So anything in those sort of areas, we are very welcome and happy to look to have papers coming in from. And I think the other thing that we didn't mention, which I think is a really, really important thing, is we really want to encourage early career researchers to see this as this journal as a spiritual home where they can come and develop their ideas in a supportive environment. So that's a kind of body of researchers rather than an area of research that we would like to have further papers from.
Just to follow up, I think you know, the area of the interaction of race with the labour process and labour movement, we really want to encourage Black academics and scholars to submit. So we really hope that that will happen in the next year or two. And the area of the future of work we've mentioned, but some of the more journalistic discussions about sort of utopian nature of the future of work, you know, the campaigning against labour time or work time altogether, you know, automated communism, that kind of thing. I think it would be in the remit of this journal to consider those debates, but to ground them empirically as well.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm afraid I think we're going to have to wrap up now. So I'm going to, Kirsty and Sian, did you want to say any closing comments before we finish?
Other than just to thank everybody who has been involved in getting this launch issue out, we really appreciate the mammoth task it was for everybody. And to say we really welcome any discussions you may want to have about future papers. Sian and I are more than happy to have conversations with people.
Lovely. Thank you very much, everybody. And do explore the journal where there is free access to it, because we understand that institutions won't yet have subscribed. So there's free access to it until the end of the year. And then we hope that you'll be encouraging your institutions to subscribe so that we can all support the journal for many years ahead. And thank you very much, everybody all around the world, speakers and participants, for joining us today. It was great to see you all.